Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth episode of our podcast series dedicated to women working in the field of sustainability. And I'm Tonia Plakhotniuk, and I will be your host today. And it's a great pleasure to be joined by two incredible women, Aleksandra Palinska and Dr. Nicola Ranger. Aleksandra is leading the Eurosif, or the European Sustainable Investment Forum, which is a pan-European association promoting sustainable finance at the EU level. And Nicola is a well-known academic amongst many other roles that she holds. She's director of Resilient Planet Finance Lab and senior research fellow in the Global Finance and Economy program of the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. And huge thank you, Aleksandra and Nicola, for being able to join us today. And I'm really excited to learn about your backgrounds and your personal stories. So maybe Aleksandra, turning to you first. We know each other from some time ago, met in Brussels. I think I still remember our joint meetings with the public officials at the EU level. But if you could tell us about your personal journey and how you found your way into the field of sustainability.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Tonia, for inviting me to take part in this podcast. Hello, everyone. Also great to meet you, Nicola, and take part actually in this discussion. So in terms of my personal journey, I've started working in EU public affairs in Brussels around 15 years ago. I've been always focusing on financial services. So I have worked for a range of different European Brussels-based organizations representing a range of different stakeholders. So I have actually started my career working for Better Finance, representing the interests of retail investors and financial services consumers. Afterwards, I moved on to European issuers representing the interests of publicly listed companies. Afterwards, I worked for EFAMA, which is European Asset Management Association, where I actually started my sustainability-related journey as I have supported the ESG and Stewardship Standing Committee there, working very closely with asset manager representatives throughout Europe. Afterwards, I moved on to Finance Watch, which is an expertise center with a mission to make finance serve society. And there I led also the work on sustainable finance. At Finance Watch, I also joined the EFRAG Sustainability Reporting Board, helping craft European sustainability reporting standards. And I also served as a Sherpa on the platform on sustainable finance. 2 years ago, I joined Eurosif, so the European Sustainable Investment Forum, and you have already mentioned, and I must say this is a very exciting job as well. We're working very closely with asset managers and asset owners throughout Europe. At the same time, Eurosif is a mission-driven organization, and hence, basically, we strive for ambitious and yet implementable rules.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Aleksandra. Very important role you are taking. And Nicola, what about you?
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you today, and thank you for the invitation to join. I guess my journey is quite different, and I guess I sort of started in sustainability and then more came into finance. So perhaps sort of the opposite way round to Aleksandra. But so I actually started as a physicist. So my PhD is in atmospheric physics, which basically meant that I was studying how the climate works. And I always had a deep passion for climate change and for working on climate policy. That was always my huge ambition. And after my PhD, went straight into Treasury in the UK, so our Ministry of Finance in the UK, and worked on something called the Stern Review on the economics of climate change, which was in that sort of golden era around the G20 first commitments on a 2-degree goal at that time. Sorry, the G7 2-degree goal commitment, sort of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, that sort of era. And that was sort of my first tasting coming into the economics side. Because I think what I found is that as a scientist, there was always a frustration that, we could shout about the science and why sustainability was important, but as a scientist, you always felt that perhaps it wasn't being taken seriously enough. So I thought, right, I will get into the economics. And if I can put numbers on this and sort of show why it's economically beneficial to act on climate change, that must be the answer. So hence I sort of went to Treasury and moved more into the economic side, and had the great pleasure to work with Lord Nick Stern on that. But then went from there to working on climate policy. So I worked on the international climate negotiations. But actually, even then, I sort of went through economics and thought, with just these big numbers, we were still not getting the traction we needed. So, right, I'm going to work on policy. But even then, working on policy, we were still struggling to get the traction. So I thought, right, what's the solution then? I will work on finance. Finance must be the solution to these issues. So that's when I sort of transitioned across more to working on the finance side, initially actually in the insurance industry. So atmospheric physicists who want to go into finance, that's the sort of easiest way in. So first went into insurance, and then moved across more to working on broader sort of climate finance issues, and eventually ended up in development finance in what was DFID, is now called the FCDO in the UK, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And then to the World Bank. So I've always, my other deep passion is working in emerging and developing economies and sort of mobilizing finance there for sustainability. So I did a few years at the World Bank. And then from there, sort of went back to academia about 3.5 years ago. So I guess after sort of going through that full loop, came back to think about, no, we need the evidence. And we always heard from financial institutions, we need the evidence on where the returns are, the risks. So sort of ended up going back into academia, but I work very closely with financial institutions. So my research is all around sort of what is the scale of the risks, and where are the opportunities, and where are the returns from mobilizing more finance into action. And about 2 years ago now, I established the Global Finance Group in the Environmental Change Institute, which is a team of about 20 researchers, all with a sort of deep passion for how we can sort of align finance and make it beneficial for financial institutions and businesses to be working on climate change. So that's my journey.
Thanks so much, Nicola. You had a fantastic and rich journey to get where you are with a wealth of experience. And of course, representing a financial institution myself, I can definitely say that your work is of paramount importance as well. And it's hard, I think, to implement the science and the theory, but thanks to yourself and your colleagues, it's becoming possible gradually, step by step. I'm also curious, maybe staying with you, Nicola, first, just to hear more about your day-to-day. What does it mean in practice, what you're doing? How are you working with the financial institutions, and how are you helping them implement the climate and nature-related science into their businesses?
Sure, and I should say that, as any person leading an organization, a lot of my time is spent on management. So in the fun part of my job, which is working with financial institutions, so there are different parts. So as an academic institution, everything we do has to be fundamentally sort of evidence-based and very, very rigorous, very independent. So that's sort of the key principles by which we work. But certainly, exactly as you've said, Tonia, and one of the issues on this area is that you can have all of the best science and the best data out there, but if it's not really communicated well and in a way that's relevant to financial institutions, then it's really hard to use it. And what we find in our work with financial institutions is that there's a real gap between what's coming out of the scientific community and what is actually useful to financial institutions. And particularly in where we are now in huge new sort of disclosure frameworks and things like that, a lot of financial institutions saying, well, where do we even get started in bringing all of the knowledge that we need to address all of these different issues and actually identify where the benefits are. So in my day-to-day work, so we spend a lot of time either working bilaterally with financial institutions to understand what challenges are they facing, what are their questions, how can we help with that. So we have a number of sort of collaborations and partnerships on a more bilateral basis, but we also work with, particularly through sort of big working groups with financial institutions. So for example, we over the last 18 months have been particularly working with the UK's Climate Financial Risk Forum, which is a forum established under the Bank of England with the FCA and the PRA our two financial regulators, that sort of brings together a sort of peer learning group around climate. So we work with that group, and to give an example of one of the things we've worked on is with their adaptation working group. So this is a group, and actually it was hugely oversubscribed. It was co-chaired by Green Finance Institute and Impacts Asset Management, Ingrid Holmes and Kath Bremner, who are two other wonderful women that you should bring on the podcast at some point. So they co-chaired a group, but it was about 40 different financial institutions involved, all really sort of trying to get to grips with adaptation. What does that mean? Where are the opportunities for financial institutions? What should we be doing now? And we, as the sort of technical advisors to that group, were working with them to help answer some of those questions as we were going along. But as part of that, provided key pieces of evidence and research that they needed. So, for example, we produced a synthesis of all of the taxonomies that are out there, obviously starting with the EU one as the key one, as I'm sure Aleksandra was working on, but then put that together with the taxonomies from other countries as well, and just sort of made that available to them. And similarly on sort of data, just showing them, doing a big synthesis of these are all the data sources that you can use, and sort of providing some guidance around that. So it's some examples of the types of things that we do.
And turning to you, Aleksandra, what's your day-to-day? And also wanted to ask you, what inspires you on a daily basis to keep doing what you're doing?
Well, similarly to Nicola, I end up spending a lot of my day-to-day on managing the organization, and actually it's quite diverse, right? Because, well, in any case, we're a very small team. So one day I have to be more accountant and ensuring we have financial resources, fundraising. Another day, basically being a more key spokesperson for the organization, speaking at some conferences. Another day, being a bit of a researcher / policy, senior policy advisor, reviewing actually our reports or positions, helping also craft and review press releases. So honestly, at the end of the day, it's quite versatile. And in any case, always kind of coordinating our small team, dealing with our members, which are national sustainable investment fora throughout Europe. And yes, as well, of course, we are working quite closely together with investors throughout Europe as well that are either members of our member organizations. Also in the future, we're now developing a Eurosif club, whereby we're developing more direct relationship with some investor and other financial market participants. So yes, it's quite diverse in terms of what motivates me in a day-to-day. And well, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting actually the most important bit, which is basically engagement with EU policymakers, right? Because at the end of the day, this is a key role of actually Eurosif is basically influencing EU rules with regards to sustainable finance. And as I usually sum it up, striving for ambitious and implementable rules. So indeed, we have been working on EU taxonomy of the environmentally sustainable economic activities, also European sustainability reporting standards, corporate sustainability due diligence directive, the RISE greenwashing rules, sustainable finance disclosure regulation, which is, I think, one of the also very close to our heart regulations, and with the forthcoming review, EU green bonds, ESG ratings, so quite a big of a variety. In the future, we might be working also on certain aspects related to stewardship and engagement in the context of the review of the shareholder rights directive. Maybe also they're calling for the EU stewardship code. Finally, thinking maybe in addition to the climate benchmarks, do we need some other benchmarks like ESG benchmarks? So that's obviously an important bit. So obviously we do have quite a lot of meetings with EU policymakers ranging from the European Commission, representatives, European Parliament and the Council. But the bottom line is, in order to make that successful, obviously there has to be a lot of work done, I would say, in the back office, and of course a lot of discussions and engagement with investors and other financial market participants, which is very much also facilitated by my colleagues, and in particular our senior policy advisor. So in terms of actually what motivates me is, as I mentioned, our mission, right? So basically striving for sustainable growth and development through financial markets, in particular investments. So I think what is very interesting, and it's a great opportunity also to meet you, Nicola, because I think we have a lot of possible common points and interests. And as Eurosif, we are also collaborating actually with some academics. And indeed, something that I have been also thinking more and more about, that there are indeed still certain gaps in terms of research, where I think we do need even more evidence, more than ever, actually showing that indeed investing sustainably and with impact, it does not mean giving up financial returns, right? Also actually demonstrating that sustainable funds are not really more expensive than other types of funds, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is indeed really great that you're doing also there this work. And on our end, in a way, on one hand side, I think we're trying to promote things towards the EU policymakers, but at the same time, I think we do also quite a lot of engagement with investors and financial institutions, not only to actually gather their feedback, input and feedback, but at the same time, I think we're also trying to play a little bit the role of those who are actually explaining EU rules, and also the importance of the EU rules and implementing them in a way that will help achieve their objective.
Perfect. Thanks, Aleksandra. And I'm increasingly becoming happier and happier that I have connected the two. Maybe some future collaboration could be possible. And in terms of day-to-day or recent projects, if maybe Nicola, turning to yourself, has there been anything, any project or activity that you've been, I would just say, especially excited about, that you've achieved it, you've done it, and if you face the challenges, which often happens, how did you get to overcome them?
Yeah, thanks very much. That's a great question, and it's lovely to be hearing about Aleksandra's work, and I can see the many similarities in our days, particularly the juggling of many different tasks and hats that you have to wear when you're sort of leading a sort of small to medium-sized organization in particular. So I guess the thing that really is firing me up at the moment is the work on nature, actually. And actually, I should say that the EU has obviously been a real key leader on this, and the fact that nature is within CSRD, the fact that the ECB has been pushing this so much, has a clear climate nature strategy, has driven momentum around the world. And one of the biggest projects I've worked on over the last year is the UK's nature-related financial risk assessment. So we were asked to look at, what is the evidence on the financial materiality of nature for the UK economy, to help justify action, particularly by banks on this agenda. So we were particularly focused on the banking sector. And for that, I think there were a number of challenges. And certainly for me, setting out on that journey, even from a technical side, so this had never been done before. So a lot of the work that had been done on nature told you about what we call these dependencies. So it will say this agricultural sector is highly dependent on nature. Great. And you get these big numbers that sort of say, yes, the WEF, for example, the World Economic Forum, saying 50% of our global economy is dependent on nature, which I must say I think is total rubbish, because 100% of our economy is dependent on nature if you take into account the air that we breathe and the water that we drink. But those numbers don't really mean anything from a financial materiality perspective, do they? How does NatWest say, all right, well, what's the impact for NatWest's actual balance sheet from nature? It's a very different type of question, and no one had really looked at that before. So when we set out on this journey, we had that technical challenge of, okay, well, how do we even do that with all of the constraints that we have? And I guess for me, one of the things I kept saying to myself was, so I said I worked on the Stern Review when I was quite young. So I was only sort of 25, 26 as part of a big team. And that was assessing climate financial risks for the whole economy. And I said, right, if I can do that when I'm 25, 26, now I'm in my 40s, I can do this. I kept sort of telling myself that, and that kind of drove me forward. But then other than the sort of more technical challenges, just lots and lots of, particularly sort of working with stakeholders. So for stakeholders, there's a lot of interest in this space, but they themselves are really just getting to grips with how they even think about this agenda. So there was a lot of educating stakeholders as to why this is important. And we saw real strong interest, actually. So it wasn't really a case of trying to sort of show, get people interested, but to sort of trying to take the whole community along with us on the journey and talk about, this is how we're looking at this, how are you looking at it? And really that sort of sharing across the financial sector and the technical institutions that were involved was a big challenge. And then also bringing the regulators along as well, and having to think about this from the way that a regulator would think about that and understand their perspective on this, which again is quite different from an individual bank perspective. So those were some of the sort of challenges. And then obviously the normal ones around the models crashed at the last minute when we need to deliver the results, and how do we fix it? And we had one point where we'd sort of put in a particular scenario and basically said that the global economy is going to crash. So we had to sort of rejig that. So there are all of those sorts of fun that happens when you're working as a scientist. I think they're fun anyway, which is why I'm a scientist. But it was great. And I was incredibly proud of what we came out with at the end in April. And the partnerships as well. So it wasn't just us at Oxford, but we worked with the Green Finance Institute, Helen Avery, another sort of key female leader in this space, but also colleagues in other universities as well and other institutions. So there was that whole building a team and getting the whole team across the line, and which was a sort of challenge, but also a great pleasure as part of that. So it felt like one of those big moments where everyone comes together and sort of delivers something really big.
Yes, absolutely, Nicola. No, I think what you're doing is definitely helping to put the UK on the leadership map. You mentioned the work that has been done by the EU, and I fully agree. I think by integrating nature and biodiversity into, the mandatory disclosure rule book has been a massive achievement. But I think your work, Nicola, really helps the UK to also lead in this space domestically and internationally. So absolutely something to be very proud of. And Aleksandra, just turning to you, if you can give us an example of something that you've been really excited about, or maybe an achievement that you're proud of. And I know that working in an advocacy profession implies many challenges to overcome, especially in your primary role, I think, engaging with multiple stakeholders. But yeah, over to you.
Well, I guess indeed in the advocacy sphere, I think it can be very challenging, and at the same time, I would put it this way, coming back to also what is very much debated in the investment world, talking about impact finance, right? Is the investor additionality versus investor contribution. And everybody questioning, but can we as an investor engaging as one investor really claim that we have delivered impact, right? It's a very similar story actually to what happens in advocacy, because I think there are very rare cases when you can say, I have really made that happen. Usually actually fine, even if you're one of the important, I would say, stakeholders driving something, I think at the end of the day, it's a collective contribution, right? It's actually many people influencing it, and actually this is part of the fun also to bring other people along, right? And actually create coalitions. So I think there are some kind of interesting similarities, I would say, in terms of how you engage with regards to the European rules and policies, and how actually investors engage with the investee companies, for instance, right? Now, I guess another challenge with EU rules is that it's a bit of a never-ending story. So I think the example I'm about to bring up, I think it's not really a done deal yet, exactly. So I'm not sure I can say at this stage that I'm really proud of it, especially that I have no idea what's going to happen in the coming months and years. But I guess one of the projects where I have been personally quite involved, well, it's also like in terms of the organizations that I have been representing on this, but also, with being directly personally quite involved, is the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. As I mentioned, I served on the EFRAG's Sustainability Reporting Board, at first actually representing Finance Watch, more in the citizens, consumers seat, and later on when I joined Eurosif, I actually went to another seat representing the users. And it has been quite a challenge and quite a journey. Also, because of, I would say, the complexity of this, but at the same time, I would say some of the challenges connected to the representation of different stakeholders within EFRAG. And something that I still find personally an issue even today is I find that there is not enough investor representation within EFRAG structures, which then makes it quite challenging to convince basically a range of business organization representatives that, well, actually, this is the data that investors really need, and that it's really important that actually they remain within the European sustainability reporting standards. Also some other challenges like trying to explain to people that, well, actually maybe having some of the indicators mandatory might actually be easier even for the reporting companies and would enhance actually comparability of information for investors rather than having everything subject to materiality assessment, which is not really that obvious or even cheap at times. And some kind of a crazy stuff, even kind of trying to remind everyone that actually governance is important and that actually maybe you shouldn't really be diluting governance-related disclosures, and that actually business conduct is not really quite the same as, I would say, more pure corporate governance, and that at the end of the day, disclosures on how companies integrate sustainability considerations within their strategy, within their business model, and to what extent actually board members have experience on that, to what extent actually board members are not only informed, but actually decide, and whether they decide, and how sustainability risks are considered, I would say, within also the risk management models, that this is at the end of the day crucial and key for investors to understand also the risk and reward profile of the company, right? Especially if we are talking about more mid to long-term investment rather than short-term investment. So obviously there have been, I would say, heated debate on environmental disclosures as well, including climate, but also biodiversity and nature, as Nicola referred to. And I think this is indeed a very important topic. And at the end of the day, very closely interlinked with climate, right? And in particular, climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And yes, as well as social. This is the crazy stuff. For instance, on the platform in sustainable finance, I have been working more actually on the proposals with regards to the social aspect. So some proposals for a social taxonomy, but at the same time also working on minimum social and governance safeguards. And once again, it can be actually sometimes so strange how much actually objections there can be, politically speaking, against some of this kind of disclosures, even including in terms of actually how many women there are on boards. This is even in the context of European sustainability reporting standards. And then, I don't know, some voices arguing that actually for SMEs, well, we have to reduce disclosures, so why do we need to disclose how many women do you have on board? If you're an SME, how many board members do you have? Is it so difficult to count 1, 2, 3? But however, it's still very controversial and apparently burdensome. So yeah, I guess what I can be proud of is that we have contributed, I think, to ensuring that the first set of the European sustainability reporting standards, they are sector agnostic, has been adopted. It's maybe not ideal, but I think it's good enough. And it's already quite a game changer in the scale of world, I would say. Now the challenge is in the current political environment actually to ensure that it's retained. But so I guess I could actually give that as an example of, you know, an achievement in terms of my contribution.
Thank you so much, Aleksandra. I think the European sustainability reporting standards are, of course, within the industry are being seen as a big undertaking. But I also see many large businesses in particular running the programs to be able to report. And I think they're also finding that they're getting to learn about their organizations much better and also discovering risks and opportunities that I haven't really thought of before. So I appreciate it can be the challenge, but hopefully there will be more and more recognition that it's a necessary step to undertake. Thank you so much for that.
It's very, if I could just maybe actually react to that for a second, because I think it's very important what you're saying, and especially in the current context, where I think indeed the debate has focused on I would say, difficulties connected to applying all those rules, right? Rather than actually looking at the benefits. It seems to me that actually people in Brussels have even nearly forgotten why are we doing those standards. I think they have forgotten we are doing them for investors. And that we can't really scale up investments for sustainable growth and competitiveness without actually having the data, ESG data. If you go to any investor conferences, the topic of the data is still there. And the bottom line is actually these standards, they have not been even properly implemented yet, right? Because now, this year is actually the first year that the largest companies, so companies with more than 500 employees, are only starting to actually collect the data, with the first sustainability reports to be published next year. So it's really way too early to actually even assess, I would say, really, well, the costs and I would say the impact of those rules. But as you say, I think it's also very important to keep in mind that these kind of actually preparing this kind of disclosures, if this is used, I would say, very sensibly, can be basically decision useful information for the reporting companies themselves. And we have been actually in touch with certain fintech companies that exactly have developed this kind of tools, helping not only actually to gather the data and then aggregate it actually for the reporting, but to make it actually more decision useful.
Very interesting. Add on a little bit as well, actually, just to sort of reinforce that point. And I sort of draw on a quote from Mark Carney: the more we invest with foresight, the less we regret with hindsight. So it's about sort of meeting our goals in terms of mobilizing finance, but it's also fundamentally about risk. There are risks at the moment that investors just cannot see. Because they don't have that data, and we cannot be resilient. The financial sector cannot be resilient if we don't have that data. And I think this is almost, I think it is a transition as well. We're sort of learning by doing at the moment, and we're sort of transitioning to a new model of operating, and that will always, be a challenge. But once we're there, and I love your example of the fintech companies getting into this space as well, Aleksandra, I think things will smooth out, and certainly we're learning a lot. So I sort of had the pleasure to be part of the GTAG in the UK, which is the advisory group looking at the UK's taxonomy. And we spent a lot of time looking at all the lessons from the EU taxonomy and going through where there were ambiguities and what we could learn from that. And it is a learning process. And I think there will be a few years of where we have to go through that process. And I think then it will just become the norm to do it.
Exactly. And actually, I quite like an expression used by one of actually our allies, referring to it as process of the growing pains. And I think that's the thing. It's exactly as you're saying, Nicola. I think we are on a transition. And the bottom line is, like, any new rules are always at first a bit burdensome. And in general, as people, I think we just hate change. We are change averse. So basically, whenever it's a new effort, and as you say, and especially with the reporting, the first years are always the most difficult, because you have to set up all the processes, also even in terms of IT processes, trying to assess. I think the first assessment in terms of like what kind of information is actually material for your company, it's always the most challenging at the beginning, but I think with time it will just go on.
Yeah, and I think as well that I think the worst thing that the EU could do is roll it back.
Exactly.
That's where it gets painful.
Right? So the thing is, like, we also need regulatory stability. Yeah. And I think we need to see how it goes. I think, of course, it is common, I would say, sense to at the same time try to gather feedback, assess to what extent all of these metrics are helpful and decision useful. But it's also, as you said, it's just about managing actually sustainability risks. And it's for investors to be better aware the riskiness and risk-adjusted, returns that can be expected from this kind of investment. But at the same time, it's also like the investee companies being better aware of the risks they might be facing that they might not even be aware of, right?
No, thank you. I'm hoping that there won't be any rollback as such. I hope that is just what has been meant by various statements in this respect, means that maybe some revision, some simplification in certain areas could be achieved, but hopefully we're not going to see the rollback of the legislation. And you've touched upon a little bit on this, but for both of you, what future holds for sustainability. Where do you see sustainability space evolving going forward? We do live in quite turbulent times, but how do you see maybe next year or a few years? Maybe Nicola, you first.
Yeah, well, I guess so. I do expect, particularly given various sort of geopolitical changes across the world, there will be a couple of years of a lot of questions and a lot of sort of discussion about what we've learned and whether this is all necessary. But I think what I expect to see is, and we've had a very, very rapid transition and sort of implementation of a whole range of policies and frameworks in this space. And the issue of greenwashing has become a big one as well. Lots of discussions about that. And we now hear about issues of green hushing. I think this is all now going to lead to actually a much more sort of mainstreamed and pragmatic and realistic approach to this agenda that I think will actually be really, really positive. So I'm expecting this now to become what I'd love to see in a couple of years, and I think this will happen, is this just becomes the mainstream. This just becomes recognize that these sustainability risks are part of all of the risks that financial institutions and corporates should be thinking about, and becomes just a part of the way that we're working within the financial sector. I think that what we really need to see, though, and sort of moving slightly onto the topic of policy, I do feel that in the last couple of years, we as a society have been putting a lot on the financials that haven't necessarily been acting at the same pace as the financial sector has. And I think we need a bit of a sort of rebalancing. And I'd really like to see the financial sector saying, actually, look, we've done our bit. We've implemented these policies. We've got all these frameworks in place. Now you need to do your bit. You need to set very clear targets for different sectors. You need to be putting in place the right policies to enable us to finance those sectors, be it blended finance or improved planning regulations, whatever it is, and for that to be a more balanced dialogue between the financial sector and government. So what I would really like to see, and I think we are beginning to see that in a number of countries, is government sort of coming back and really stepping up on this agenda.
Nicola, Aleksandra?
Well, honestly, I couldn't agree more with what Nicola said. And I think at the EU level, we are now with the new commission, soon to be hopefully adopted, new parliament. We are entering a new legislative mandate. And I think what is quite clear that now the new focus is on competitiveness, growth, security, and basically also the focus more on implementing in terms of what has been already developed. And which is a good thing, because the bottom line is, even if you have the best rules, if they are not properly implemented and enforced, they're not going to deliver, right? At the same time, I think as a lot of different rules have been within the sphere of sustainable finance developed in parallel or sometimes not properly sequenced, and it was quite indeed a rapid, I would say, phase. Now it's also time, together with the implementation, trying to look like what are some inconsistencies or maybe unnecessary overlaps where we need to ensure alignment, for instance, on transition plans and climate targets, so that actually indeed we can ensure comparability of information for investors and at the same time minimize the reporting burdens, or, well, the burdens of actually setting and applying those transition plans and climate targets. So yes, I think we're definitely entering this phase. There are still certain gaps that can also be filled, like for instance that I've mentioned with regards to stewardship and engagement, which is becoming definitely, I think, seen as a very important tool for investors to contribute to the transition, basically pushing companies to set and implement climate targets and transition plans, and basically to transition and implement, actually, I would say, those transition plans and climate targets. But I think there are still some barriers to shareholder engagement and shareholder collaboration that exist, so they need to be abolished. At the same time, we probably need some kind of a minimum safeguards to prevent stewardship washing, basically, so that those that are actually using it as an argument, this is a transition fund, and we're using stewardship to basically demonstrate that. And another, for instance, gap we're seeing is with regards to the ESG benchmarks. And this is quite amazing because benchmarks, they play a key role, right, in financial markets. And there is a huge amount of passive investments, which could be also, I think, channeled and leveraged to finance and support the transition. At the same time, even in terms of active, actually, investment management, benchmarks are used quite frequently. As Eurosif, we believe it's worthwhile to actually look beyond climate benchmarks that maybe also need a little bit of adjustments here and there, and consider maybe also benchmarks in other environmental fields, but also social, and some kind of a minimum criteria across the board, basically to prevent also greenwashing in that space. But finally, just to touch upon what Nicola was saying, we also very much believe that it's also time for public sector to play their role, right? And that means in terms of this national level actually targets and helping actually companies apply all these rules in maybe some contacts, national center contact points where especially smaller companies could get either free of charge or at a very low cost advice and help to prepare their sustainability reporting standards, but the disclosures in line with the sustainability reporting standards, but also actually to help design transition plans and climate targets, but that need actually proper targets at national level, but then also pathways actually depending on sectors. So there is quite a lot of work there. But what Nicola also mentioned in terms of blended finance is kind of a de-risking mechanism, public-private partnership. This is also crucial. And let's not forget tax incentives. A beautiful tool that works miracles, but unfortunately is sometimes forgotten.
Thanks, Aleksandra. I'm very mindful of time to maybe one question from our previous guests, and also give you an opportunity to maybe ask a question to the future guests to the podcast so that we continue this lovely tradition. But I think maybe I wanted to conclude asking you whether you're optimistic or worried about where the world is heading with regard to sustainability and why you're thinking so. Very quickly, maybe Nicola, yourself first.
But so I always am optimistic. I'm a positive person, I guess. So that I'd sort of split my optimism differently between high income markets and the sort of developing countries, which is also an area of my work. So I think for high income countries, we will get there in terms of sustainability. And what we always see, so I've worked in this area for 20 years and it's always up and down, and there's periods of acceleration and deceleration. And, the last couple of years have been very difficult with the horrendous things that are happening in Ukraine and the impact that that's had globally on oil prices and how that sort of shifted financial markets. But we always have those kind of setbacks. So I do expect us to sort of come back on track. And investment, which saw some of my colleagues recently just this week published some work showing that the transition is very much still happening, as in we're still seeing a massive transition towards more renewables. We're seeing the price of renewables coming down massively. What is happening on nature is incredibly exciting. Going back to the EU, things like the EU biodiversity strategy. So there's a lot to be positive about, I think. And always, when we're in these a couple of years when things feel a bit more difficult, it's always challenging. But I think things will get there. And fundamentally, this is a massive business opportunity. The transition towards a low carbon, nature positive economy is a massive business opportunity. And so I'm very optimistic there. I think where it's more challenged, shall we say, is what's happening in a lot of emerging and developing economies at the moment, and particularly the poorest countries, because they're really facing a bit of a triple whammy in that they're most exposed to the impacts of climate change. They also will see transition risk as well. So a lot of them are oil dependent economies, and a lot of their revenues from extractives. But then also suffering debt crises as well for the poorest countries as well. And all of these things kind of come together. And sadly, I don't think we're addressing that properly as a world at the moment. And we're recording this just before COP29 starts. So I really hope that at COP29, we see some progress on these issues. But for me, that's where I'd really like to see more progress made and more the world sort of stepping up to support countries.
Thanks, Nicola. And Aleksandra, if you have a few minutes, maybe.
Yes, I guess I'm also cautiously optimistic on some, I would say, aspects, and increasingly pessimistic on others. So I'll start maybe with those where actually my optimism has been declining. I guess what has been quite disappointing is political level developments in Europe and, well, beyond, right? And I think this is quite disappointing. And on one hand side, I also fully agree with Nicola. This is cyclical, right? And always has been. But my worry is we're running out of time. We have already breached several of the planetary boundaries. And I think scientists, NGOs are warning that we're already getting very dangerously close to the stage whereby I think already now, even if we now go full speed with regards to climate mitigation and adaptation, we already might not be able to stop actually some of the developments, right? We might slow it down. We might somehow mitigate the development of that, but we're already a little bit late. So this is my kind of worry that I think right now, the next 5 years is when we really have to act. Where I'm more optimistic is, I think, similarly to Nicola, I believe that businesses more and more and investors see this as a business value proposition, as a business opportunity. I think there is an increasing awareness among the businesses and I would say society in general. I also have hope in the younger generation because I think these are the people that realize so much more than others that there is actually the need to act and change the way we do business, the way we live, basically. So yes, I'm basically kind of hopeful. And I think this is what I'm trying to put out as a message. It's like, let's disregard the politics to some extent, even I would say not focus so much on the regulation, but let's just do our bit to address them.
Thank you so much. I knew if you were to ask just one question to our future guests, what would that be?
I think given this is a podcast around women and leadership as well as sort of sustainability issues, I think I would ask the what would you say to your 22-year-old self? And I think around 22 is when you get, as a woman, is a really interesting transition time of going into work and trying to work out how you can add value. So what would be your advice to that 22-year-old version of yourself?
An amazing question. Aleksandra?
I guess it could be also interesting to hear, at the end of the day, there is never one single silver bullet, but I think it's usually still interesting to ask if somebody could have one recommendation, for instance, to policymakers and businesses, what would that be? And basically, what would be the recommendation for the way forward?
Perfect. Thank you so much. And huge thank you to yourself, Aleksandra and Nicola, for sharing your insights, the stories today. It was really great to learn about your personal journeys, your motivations, your ambitions, and all the wealth of experience that you are bringing to the table and to the resolution of all the critical challenges that the world is facing right now with regard to climate change and biodiversity loss and degradation. And also thank you to everyone for listening in to our 5th episode of the Women in Sustainability podcast. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and that you stay tuned for future episodes released on our channel. We'll continue to explore inspiring stories from amazing women working in sustainability. I really hope to see you again next time.